Hi everyone, my name is Reba Carruth. I'm very happy to be with you today. My paper is entitled Transatlantic and UN Global Cooperation should be for CO2 emissions reduction in automotive industries and agriculture industries. So I'm going to use the next 15 minutes to give you an overview of my paper and the topic, and to also follow up with discussion if you're interested. But I would like to just get started and introduce the paper. The paper focuses on the issue of US-EU cooperation and conflict relative to the regulation of gas emissions from strategic agriculture and automotive industries. Now, the relevance of this paper is twofold. One, because the United States and the European Union historically were transformed by an industrial revolution in the late 19th century, early 20th century, which relied on the integration and the industrialization of agriculture and natural resources for mass production and value-added consumption of goods that are being produced, which left a very large footprint on the natural environment. And when we come forward to today, what we see is that this issue of natural resource efficiency, sustainability of agriculture, and mass manufacturing are now part of the context of emissions that are being generated from the non-sustainable use of land and also of natural resources. So I thought this was a very important issue, the role of the transatlantic region in the broader effort of the UN Global Climate Agreement, and also because the United States, which did join the agreement under President Obama, is now in the position of considering withdrawal from the climate agreement, while Europe is really accelerating the efforts to comply with the goals of this agreement. But again, these two nations are nations that also are part of a larger global system within which agriculture and food products and services related to the automotive industry and transportation industry are central and crucial. So mitigation of greenhouse gases are very important. Now, the other thing is carbon dioxide is very often looked at as the most important greenhouse gas, but methane gas coming from animal livestock is also a very important issue when we're looking at reducing emissions from agricultural production and also automotive industry and transport industry activities and manufacturing. So in this paper, I'm looking at how the reduction of greenhouse gases and emissions really is becoming more and more crucial and more intensified in terms of examining what their roles are in the different sectors and how the transition of the United States and Europe into low carbon, sustainable, and renewable economies and societies that are once again facing the need to integrate and see the larger picture of the integration of agriculture and natural resources, and in this case, automotive manufacturing and industry. So that was a very important dimension of this examination. Now, in terms of methodology, I'm using comparative case studies to look at the policy responses of the United States and the European Union. So these case studies look at the agricultural and farming and food production industries and sectors in both countries, looking at where we are now, where we are trying to go in the context of this global climate agreement. Unfortunately, there's not enough information put on the evolution of the transition of agriculture and farming and agri-food industry production in the direction of sustainability and low carbon net zero production. There's more of that on the automotive side. Within the United Nations, there is the Working Party 29, which is part of the United Nations Commission for Europe, based in Geneva, Switzerland, for food, and FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, but it doesn't seem to have a comprehensive framework in place for the harmonization of national and regional standards based on science and the use of science-based regulation and a precautionary principle. So that was a very interesting dimension there, because we're not only looking at what the United States is doing, but also what Europe is doing and at the regional level, and also what we're trying to have in terms of harmonization of standards for emissions reduction and climate. Again, this comparative case study approach is very important. It allows us to look very deeply into what's going on within the United States, which has a federal system, but also has a very active framework for mobilization of local municipalities and states. It is the Climate Alliance that is led by the state governments and local governments, which have picked up the banner of the U.S. climate agreement, the UN climate agreement, and are really posed to really take on and adopt the requirements that are laid out by this agreement, and they plan to comply before the deadlines, which is very interesting. So under President Obama, we joined the climate agreement, and under President Trump, the decision was taken to try to come out of it. But you see the mobilization by the citizens, by communities, by local governments, mayors, and governors who have decided to move forward with this. In Europe, what you have is a slightly different situation. You have member states which are now part of a supranational structure, which means you have legally bound frameworks for the mobilization of policies. You have a common agricultural policy which covers agriculture across Europe, and also industrial policy which covers the automotive and transportation sector. So there is an opportunity to be more systematic with the application of science-based regulations to reduce emissions in the agricultural sector as well as the automotive sector. And then again, you have the mobilization of the industries, which are strategic industries that historically provide the scale and scope of services and products to meet the requirements of nations as public goods. So food falls into that category, cars, but not just cars, other automotive instruments such as trains, trucks, as well as aircraft also fall into that domain as well. So I think it's very important to look to see what has happened, where the areas of normative agreement are, what the historical source of these agreements are, and coming forward, how we can once again achieve a vision of world society which once again sees the nation state as being accountable and responsible for the well-being of its people, and at the same time understanding its role as part of a larger community of nations. I use a world society framework. That is very important because world society is the framework that develops basically in Europe, but also extends beyond Europe as a result of the fight against infectious human and animal livestock diseases. It was the international sanitary conferences that created the architecture for national policy cooperation and coordination, regulatory harmonization, and also the pooling of science. And what's very important, the pooling of science for the public interest, which means many of these scientists that worked on the development of targeted antimicrobial drugs and hygiene movements, which became part of the public hygienes and public goods structures of nations, basically were attached to universities. So that's a very interesting dimension here. What will it take to have the cooperation and to have the collective action across nations, across regions, and not just by governments, but with this alliance of government, business, and society and industry? Now, preliminary findings are as follows. Actually, the story is not as grim as it would appear. It appears the United States and the European Union recognize the science-based reasoning and requirements for the transition of agriculture to a sustainable model, to a low-carbon model. Again, the issue of markets and private interest are clearly there. But I think there has been progress which is under the radar. And that's a very good story here, where you see the automotive industries, you see the agri-food industries recognizing that it's in their interest to have sustainability and also to manage climate change. So mitigation is the goal, but also adaptation is becoming more crucial. The other issue is the need to have cooperation between the United States and the European Union on science-based regulations and standards within the specialized standard-setting bodies of the UN system. So the UN Climate Agreement is basically requiring the mobilization and enactment of its goals and its strategies at the national level, but also making sure that each nation, each region is complying with a common standard, science-based standards to reduce emissions in food production and also in automotive industries and transport industries. So a lot of conflict between the United States and the European Union. A lot of that is industry-based. And also, when we get to the automotive industry, we see a lot of mobilization by Germany. So there are some issues relative to the European Union which are related to the central role of the European Union to manage and bind Germany and France together to prevent outbreak of war and competition coming from economic and industrial interests and preventing that from spilling over into another war. But we also have this conflict manifesting itself in terms of the setting of standards. So the issue of best available technologies really speaks to the technological innovations that are basically on the table here. The diesel engine, the diesel technology for automotive vehicles, aircrafts, trucks, things like that has come to an end, as has fossil fuels. So you see both sides of this issue really having to be addressed from the point of view of where innovation at the level of firms and industries can go and how it has to be positioned once again in the context of a higher public interest, a higher collective good at the national level and in the terms of world society. So just to conclude, this paper begins with the positioning of climate change and sustainability from the beginning, from the creation of this Atlantic world, which is a world that reflects the world of empire, of European powers, Western European powers, powers that go around the world, that access territory for agriculture, natural resource extraction, bringing these things back to Europe and having a wide range of revolutions. Industrial revolutions is one part of it. Scientific revolutions is another part. Enlightenment speaks to moral revolutions and revolutions in the areas of values and commonalities between peoples. So I think that's very important as we go forward with this issue of climate change and the climate agreement. And on the American side, you have this American system, which is the vision of the founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, where you recognize that sustainability of agriculture, our economy is crucial, and it has to be strategically linked to strategic industrial manufacturing based on skilled labor and trades and focusing on renewability. So I see a lot of hope here. We have two efforts going in the direction of Green Deals, one in Europe, one in the United States, but we have to link them back to the origin of this transatlantic structure, which in many respects is crucial for the success of the UN Climate Agreement. Thank you for your attention, excuse me, and I look forward to your questions.